Hi, and welcome to another edition of Economics from Lisa's Basement. Um, what I'm trying to do in this particular section, now that you've taken the third test, and we're going to start these next two chapters, I have toyed with where to put these chapters in various semesters. Sometimes I put them at the end, sometimes I leave them where they are. If you were not loving all the math that we're doing, you're going to have a slight break for two chapters. These chapters are much more theoretical in focus, and I think particularly now with what we're dealing with the coronavirus, you can see some of these chapters in real life action in the world around you. So without further ado, let me go ahead and start Objective 1 in Chapter 10, which is talking about what are externalities. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay. So in this chapter, we're going to look at this idea of externalities and what is an externality. And I like to think of an externality in this way. To me, it just kind of makes sense. If I have traditionally up until this point, let's see if I can do this. There we go. We have been studying the demand curve, which represents those buyers which are willing and able to purchase the particular product. And we've studied the supply curve, which are those individuals which are willing and able to supply to this market. Externalities are all those individuals that might be impacted either positively or negatively, but are not necessarily buyers and are not necessarily suppliers in the market. So you can think of them much like this periphery around the private value and private cost, which is associated with the market. So we're going to encounter some new terms, but we're really interested in all those individuals who are either positively or negatively impacted, either through the production of a particular good or service or through the buying of a particular good or service. Okay. So externalities are sort of, well, they are a market failure. And when we talk about why are they a market failure, it's because if we think about a product that's being produced and has harmful side effects to its production, maybe pollution as a result, maybe caustic chemicals are a result from the production processes, then those caustic chemicals have to be stored, they have to be transported, and these ramifications of producing that product can have a very negative impact on individuals. We say that, yes, a market's efficient if those that can produce it at the lowest cost are able to do so. But what if producing it at the lowest cost means that you're going to just do the bare minimums in terms of the legal implications of pollution rather than taking a green movement here? So we're going to go ahead and just kind of go on to the next slide and talk a little bit about these externalities and what particular they are. So the first thing I think is important is to really clearly define what is an externality. So an externality is uncompensated actions by one that impact someone else. And again, we would say that this is perhaps a market failure or is a market failure because the private market does not take into consideration these bystanders. So we want to figure out a way to be able to do that. Now, externalities can either be negative consequences to a bystander or positive consequences to a bystander. So essentially what we're going to do is, if they are negative consequences to a bystander, the government is going to tax the producers, which means we're going to be manipulating the supply curve, and not necessarily manipulating it, but we're going to come up with a new supply curve, and we're going to call it something a little bit different. If, for instance, the externality is positive, then what's going to happen is the government's going to step in and subsidize. That doesn't look right. Subsidized, there's a B in there. The consumers. And so we're going to be manipulating the demand curve. Okay? So in looking at these two ways of doing this, remember that the idea here is to kind of compensate bystanders. If it's a bad thing, then we're going to be manipulating the supply curve. If it's a good thing, then we're going to be manipulating the demand curve. I also think what's important to define in this particular area is the idea that so far we've been talking about supply. In this chapter, supply is going to be known as the private cost curve. Okay, so we're changing up our terminology a little bit. Once we manipulate the supply curve to get a new supply curve, we're going to be calling this new supply curve the public cost. Public, or should I say social cost. I think that's probably a better terminology. Okay. Now, for a positive externality, we have been calling the demand curve exactly that, the demand curve. The demand curve is now going to be termed as the private value curve. Okay. And once we manipulate this demand curve to take into consideration of bystanders, this new demand curve is going to be called the social value curve. Okay, so there's some new terminology that we're going to see in this chapter. I just didn't want you to get lost in it. Okay. So here's some examples of some negative externalities. I would add to this list a bunch. I would say things like if somebody's talking on their cell phone, okay? Okay. Another one for negative externalities might be those individuals during the coronavirus who are not staying home, not washing their hands, and not taking the personal precautions. So let's put lack of social distancing. That doesn't look right either. There we go. Lack of social distancing. Some positive externalities that we could add here: restoring of historic buildings, research and development is another one, which is why the government subsidizes research and development. Some other positive externalities we might put in here are getting a flu shot. Because people from you personally won't get the flu. We could say social distancing and the idea of staying home could be a positive externality. That's why I like to say this particular chapter, being what's going on today, is going to be interesting to see kind of how this plays out. Okay, so remember that the demand curve is the value to consumers. The supply curve is the cost to the suppliers, and equilibrium is where we have the sum of producer and consumer surplus. So again, just to kind of reiterate what I said a moment ago, remember that what we have traditionally known as the demand curve, the terminology is going to change, and we're going to call that demand curve, the one we're used to working with, is the private value. Value curve. The terminology for our supply curve is likewise going to change, and we're now going to call the supply curve that we've been looking at all semester, we're going to call that the private cost curve. And I think that makes sense because they're inside the periphery of the market. Again, social the quantity equilibrium is going to be where the private value equals the private cost. So I think I'll just go ahead and put that on this slide as well. Equilibrium is where the private value equals the private cost. So again, just some new terminology that we haven't seen so far, but I think it's important to keep it clear because we do change up terms a little bit here. Okay, so this is a good representation. We have the supply curve, which we'll call the private cost curve now, the demand curve, the private value curve, and here we have equilibrium. At this point, these are all internal. This is all market driven. It's the same stuff that you've been looking at all semester. But essentially what we're going to do in this chapter is we're going to ask ourselves, but what about, all these people maybe that don't use aluminum? I'm not sure who that would be, but maybe don't use aluminum in some way. And what about all of them that are outside along this green circle? And what kind of impact do they have when we talk about the people buying aluminum and people selling or producing aluminum? Okay, so the negative externalities, again, what is the cost? Okay, so in a negative externality, essentially what we're going to do is we're asking the government to step in and to put so the government puts a cost or a tax on the supplier, because we're hoping that this tax then helps to the negative externalities. Okay, so we're hoping that that is the case. Now, in real life, that's not how it works. Things are not necessarily earmarked because it's a tax from a production of a certain good. Okay, so let me go ahead and clear that. And let's move on. So here's some negative externalities that we talked about before. So the private cost is a supply curve. But now what we want to do, and this is the important part for the government, is we also want to take into consideration those costs to the bystanders. And what that's going to look like is it's really going to look like a tax imposed by the government, which is going to create a new curve called the social cost curve. Okay, so this social cost curve is going to be above the supply curve by the amount of the tax. So basically, we're going to be shifting the private cost curve, what we have been saying is just supply, by a tax to create a new curve called social cost. Okay? Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at how this works. So here we have the slide that you saw previously with the market for aluminum. In this particular slide, we're seeing that, let me see, go here, yeah. We're seeing that the external cost is the black arrow that you see or the green arrow that I just drew. So we have the supply or private cost. We add normally some kind of tax to that, and that is what creates the new curve called the social cost curve. And notice the social cost curve is the private cost plus the external cost. Sometimes it's very difficult to see exactly how much the external cost will be. Now, Because this is something that is negatively impacting bystanders, notice what's really important here is that we took the market equilibrium and now we have the market quantity, which is socially optimum. So that's what we would call this quantity optimum. We would call that the quantity that is socially optimum. Okay, so remember, this is a bad thing. We started off with the blue curves. Then what we did was the government, because of the negative externalities for the production of aluminum, had a tax which they put on the suppliers, they levied on the suppliers, which shifted up the social cost. I'm sorry, which shifted up the original private cost supply curve, the blue line, and what it did was it created a new curve, this red line, called the social cost curve. The byproduct, or what the effect in the market is that we went from quantity market or quantity equilibrium to a quantity that's socially optimum, which is substantially less than what it was previously. Because this is a bad thing, the idea here is to get less of it. Okay, so again, the whole reason for doing or having these taxes is because the quantity that we have, the socially optimum quantity, is less than what quantity equilibrium was. Now, in looking at how the government corrects that, we just said the government's going to correct that market failure by taxing negative externalities. Okay? When we tax the negative externality, that is what we call internalizing the externality. Okay? So if a problem asks you to internalize an externality, all you're going to be doing in that problem is to look for how much the government is taxing because it's a bad thing. And we're going to start with our original supply curve, okay, which is our private cost. We're then going to shift that supply curve up by the tax and create a new curve entitled the social cost curve. Okay, the blue line would take into consideration the externalities, the negative externalities of this. And again, if I put in a demand curve here, let's put in one here like this, notice that as we look at equilibrium, we were originally right here. Here was our price. And now with the new equilibrium, let's see if I can do that. There we go. We have a higher price, but the main purpose of this is that the quantity is reduced. So we went from a point here, quantity equilibrium, to a point that is socially optimum, a quantity that's socially optimum through that tax. Now, it's not just all bad things. There are many positive externalities. For example, education is a positive externality. And studies do show us and have been done extensively in looking at, hey, if we have higher education or more education, then we tend to have better government, lower crime rates, higher productivity and wages. So the social value is greater than the private value. So essentially, when it is a positive externality, what we're going to be doing is to take our original demand curve, the one we've been studying all semester. We're going to call that the private value. And then the government will internalize the externality by providing a subsidy. And what's going to happen is we're going to shift. We're going to actually, I should say, draw a new curve, and that curve will be called the social value curve. I think this will stay on there and you can still see if I click off this. Okay, because the social value, this is something we want to get more of. That's the objective. It's a good thing, so we want more of it. Okay, let's take a look at an example. So if we come back to education, okay, I'm sorry, it's a different graph here, and we take a look at, okay, so over here we have the price of education and the quantity of education. The government heavily subsidizes education, both K through 12, 100% usually, as well as higher education. So prior to subsidization, we start here at the two blue lines. So we have the demand curve, which is you guys taking classes, and you're the private value. We then have higher education institutions like Lake Michigan College, and we comprise on this blue line the supply or the private cost. Because we know that education is such an important thing, the government will step in and internalize this externality. How will they do it? They will provide a subsidy, Pell Grants, for example, maybe scholarships, Michigan, Kalamazoo Promise, all of these things. And they'll step in and provide this subsidy. Because this is a positive thing and we want more of it, when the government provides the subsidy, then the blue private value curve, we can see that it's not really shifted. I don't want to use that. There's a new line which comes into play, the red line, and that red line is the social value, okay, which takes into consideration your willingness to take classes, your willingness perhaps to pay out of pocket, and also the subsidy as well. So your private willingness to pay plus the subsidy. Okay, so when we start with the market, if we start with this market of just the blue lines, we're saying there's a positive externality. What's our intent? Our intent is to get more of it. So the government steps in, provides a subsidy. Let me walk you through this. So we're right here. Here's our quantity in the equilibrium. Here it's quantity market. That's our equilibrium. The government says education's a good thing. We need more of it. So they step in with a subsidy. What happens is then the demand curve, we have a new one that we say, okay, this is the willingness to pay by buyers plus the subsidy by the government. And that is the action of internalizing the externality. What is the effect of this? The effect of it is we get more, right? So we end up at the quantity that is optimum, and that's kind of what we want to get to. The goal of a positive externality is to get more of it. Okay, so again, how does the government internalize these externalities? The government will internalize a positive externality by creating a subsidy. Negative externalities, what is the government going to do? The government is going to tax them. And again, this is internalizing the externality. If it's a positive thing, the government is going to subsidize it. Okay, so that concludes my lecture for the first portion of chapter 10. Remember, start looking out for positive externalities and negative externalities. And think about, especially in the coronavirus, what are some of the positive externalities that you're seeing? What are some of the negative externalities you're seeing? What I'm going to do is to start a discussion, and you can post to it anytime you get to this. And I'll provide you with some extra credit, say 10 points for posting to the discussion on externalities in while living with the coronavirus. Thanks. Have a great day.